There's this one image from Tempest, the last mecha that's been stuck in my head ever since the credits rolled. Colt, in his beat-up janitor uniform, standing in the reflection of a mech hangar window. On the other side you've got this towering war machine lit in surgical white, and in the glass his face overlaps with the metal. He looks like a ghost haunting his own legend. That's basically the whole show right there, this guy who used to be the mech king, pretending to be nobody, while the world quietly falls apart without him. And when he finally snaps back into that role because the one person who ever saved him is about to die in a rigged mech duel, yeah, things go from sad guy with a mop to neural sync nuclear pretty fast. Welcome back to Bongo Gaming, by the way. If you're new here, I dig into dramas that orbit around gaming, mechs, sci-fi, adrenaline, all that good stuff, but I like picking apart the feelings under the explosions. If you vibe with long, ranty, slightly emotional breakdowns like this, feel free to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. No pressure, just if you're already like, okay, this person also thinks too much about fictional robots. So, Tempest, the last mecha. On paper, it sounds like one of those power fantasy mech shows we've all seen versions of. Colt Tomey, legendary mech king, traumatized by his parents' deaths, goes off the grid. He's hiding as a janitor. The only reason he's even alive is because Freya, this insanely capable woman he quietly loves from the sidelines, pulled him back from the edge at some point. Then she gets betrayed, thrown into a lethal mech duel she's not meant to walk out of, and Colt's whole "I'm done with war" thing shatters. He jumps back into his old mech, the Tempest, hits a perfect 100% neural sync, and suddenly we're in "I will crush you and your alien swarm and your conspiracies and your entire concept of safety" mode. That's the skeleton we're working with. I'm going to keep things at a moderate spoiler level for this first deep dive. I will talk about Colt's identity, Freya's betrayal, and the fact that he does end up piloting the Tempest and facing down an extinction-level alien swarm. That's all in the basic premise. But I won't start detailing every late-game twist or super-specific death scene. We're focusing more on how the story feels and moves, not ticking off every plot beat like a wiki page. What immediately hooked me with Tempest wasn't even the mecha or the alien threat, it was how aggressively small Colt's world is when we first meet him. He's not that cool smirking ace pilot they show you in flashbacks. He's this closed-off, hunched-over guy pushing carts, scrubbing floors that never really get clean, avoiding eye contact with people who walk straight past him. The show lingers on that. It doesn't rush to say, surprise, he's the mech king, like it's some cheap twist. It lets you sit with his brokenness long enough that when you see glimpses of what he used to be, it actually hurts. Where the series gets interesting is in the tension between the janitor persona and the legend under the surface. There's a version of this story that would have Colt hop into the cockpit in episode 1, dropping one-liners, and calling it a day. Tempest really leans into the idea that hiding is easier than being a hero, especially when your last run at heroism cost you your parents and who knows how many lives. You feel that cowardice and that self-preservation, but it never plays him as pathetic. It plays him as someone whose trauma is functional. He's staying small because the last time he was big, people died. But the thing that kept me watching wasn't just Colt's internal mess, it was his non-relationship with Freya. And I say non-relationship because at least at the start, it's very one-sided. He's in love with her in that heartbreakingly quiet way, he keeps his distance, he watches her move through the world like it still owes her a fight, and he never says anything. Freya is the one who dragged him back from the brink before the show even starts, so there's this asymmetry from the beginning. She saved his life. He cleans up in the background of hers. You can feel this massive emotional debt he thinks he can never repay. Here's the thing that really surprised me, the show doesn't try to make their dynamic cute. It's not bantery or flirty or rom-com adjacent. It's awkward, loaded, and honestly kind of painful. Freya exists in this zone where she knows Colt isn't just some random janitor, you can tell from the way she occasionally looks at him for half a second too long, like she's waiting for him to step up, but she respects his silence more than she pushes him. Meanwhile, Colt is doing everything in his power to stay invisible precisely because he's so terrified of what stepping up would actually mean. The betrayal that shoves Freya into that lethal mech duel feels like the emotional hinge of the whole show, even if you don't know all the mechanics behind it. We don't need the exact politics to understand the emotional math. She thinks she's fighting for something righteous, and then suddenly she's cornered into a fight she's not meant to walk away from. Tempest frames this as a point of no return for Colt more than for Freya, which is an interesting choice. Her life is on the line, obviously, that's the immediate tension, but thematically, it's about Colt losing the last excuse he has to stay in hiding. If he lets her die, then what was the point of her saving him in the first place? Let me talk about that duel sequence for a second, because this is where the directing and sound design finally start screaming, okay, we're in a mecha series now. The build-up is quiet. You get the sense of preparation, the ritual of it, Freya's mech being armed, the final pre-flight checks, the way her breathing is just a little too fast inside the cockpit. The sound here is sharp and minimal, the mechanical clank of armor locking in, the hum of systems spinning up, distant crowd noise bleeding in but kept muffled, like it's happening behind glass. The focus is on her isolation. She's inside this metal titan, but she's completely alone with the knowledge she's been set up. Watching Colt during this sequence is brutal. He's still in the uniform, still on the sidelines. The camera, or just the way the show frames him, if we don't want to get too technical, treats him as blocked out by architecture. Half obscured by railings, doorways, shadows. Thematically, it's showing us that he's boxed himself in. And then comes that moment where it really clicks that this isn't just another dangerous mission, it's a death sentence for Freya. You can see it land on his face like a physical blow. The actor doesn't overplay it. There's this tiny flinch, like his body tries to recoil from the reality, and then his jaw locks because he already knows what he has to do, and he hates that he knows. What makes that scene work for me is the pacing. Tempest doesn't immediately jump from Freya's in danger to Colt's in the mech. It lets him try to hold the line of inaction for just a beat too long. That hesitation is important. When he finally moves, literally moves, running, cutting through corridors, heading for the Tempest, you feel the inertia break. The editing tightens up, cuts get faster, but they don't go chaotic. There's a steady escalation that mirrors Colt deciding, step by step, room by room, that if he dies, he dies. He's done being the ghost. And the first time he actually touches the Tempest again? That's your vivid miniscene moment. The hangar is all harsh white and cold metal, but as he walks up, there's this sense of something almost religious. The Tempest is towering, framed from below so it swallows the shot. You hear the faint echo of his footsteps against metal grating, this metallic heartbeat. He reaches out, hand trembling just slightly, and lays his palm on the hull. The sound drops out to this low, thrumming tone, like the mech is recognizing him. The neural sync systems kick on, and it's not subtle. There's a ripple of light that runs along the mecha's spine, and it's like the whole thing exhales. I have to admit, personal confession time, I got chills at that point. Even though, structurally, I knew this moment was coming the second the premise mentioned legendary Mech King and hiding as a janitor. Of course we were going to get the dramatic return. But the show earns it through how long it lets Colt stay small, how thoroughly it commits to the idea that he wants nothing to do with this world anymore. When he steps back up, it feels less like a badass power fantasy and more like someone agreeing to rip open all their unhealed wounds because somebody they love is about to die. Where Tempest gets more complicated is how it balances that intimate emotional story with the huge, almost absurdly big stakes of extinction-level alien swarm. You've basically got two storytelling engines wired together, the personal tragedy engine, dead parents, survivor's guilt, unspoken love, betrayal, identity, and the sci-fi apocalypse engine, aliens swarming, world at risk, last hope mech. When it works, it feels epic and cathartic. When it doesn't, you can feel the gears grinding a little, like the show is trying to be three different things at once. One of the more interesting choices the series makes is how it uses the neural sync concept not just as a power-up but as a kind of emotional MRI. Colt's 100% neural sync with the Tempest isn't treated like a cool video game stat, it's almost invasive. The idea that the machine is reading you completely, no hiding, no numbing, no pretending you're fine, that's terrifying. The visuals and sound design mirror that. During sync sequences, you get a barrage of sensory input, overlapping voices, distorted memories of his parents, flashes of Freya's face, the alien swarm, all bleeding together. The editing here goes disorienting in a purposeful way. You're supposed to feel overloaded. There's also something thematically potent about the fact that the same thing that makes Colt so dangerous on the battlefield, his ability to fully connect with the Tempest, is also what makes it harder for him to stay emotionally detached. The neural sync forces him to live with the consequences of what he's doing. Every time he moves, something dies. Every time he hesitates, someone else might. The mech is an amplifier, not just of strength but of responsibility. That's where the drama feels the most adult to me, even though it's wrapped in classic mecha aesthetics. Now, I know some people are going to say the show drags too much during the janitor era, before the big battles really kick in. I get that. If you came in wanting non-stop mech duels from the jump, the first stretch will test your patience. But here's my slightly contrarian take: those slower, almost mundane sequences with Colt sweeping floors and avoiding eye contact are what make the eventual 100% neural sync pay off. Without the grind of his small life, the scale of him stepping into a god machine doesn't land. You need to feel the distance between man ignored in a hallway and man who can turn the tide of an alien apocalypse. That being said, I do think the pacing stumbles in spots. There are stretches where the show seems afraid to either fully commit to quiet character work or go hard into plot progression. We get scenes that feel like they're meant to tell us, yes, Colt is still sad, yes, Freya is still fighting the system, yes, the aliens are still looming, without adding new layers. It's like the script is treading water between its big set pieces. I wouldn't call it boring, but I did catch myself thinking, okay, we get it. Push him a little harder. A big part of why it still works, though, is the performances. The actor playing Colt has this very internal style that fits the character like a glove. His body language is compact early on, shoulders rounded, gaze down, hands busy with tasks that don't really matter. He speaks in short, almost apologetic sentences, like he's always trying not to take up space. You can feel him swallowing words he wants to say to Freya. Then, when he's back in the cockpit, there's this noticeable shift. The same actor doesn't suddenly become loud or over the top, but his voice gets steel in it. Commands come out clean and sharp. The stillness in him becomes a different kind of stillness, focused, lethal, present. Freya's performance is more outwardly dynamic. She's allowed to take up space, to be commanding and vocal without the show punishing her for it. Emotionally, you see this layering of idealism and fatigue. She believes in something, justice, survival, whatever cause pulled her into this mess in the first place, but you can also see these little cracks where the betrayals and compromises have worn her down. There are moments where she glances at Colt and there's this flash of, "Where are you? I know you're something more." It never turns into a melodramatic confrontation, and I actually appreciated that restraint. Their connection is written more in negative space than in big confessions. Some of my favorite acting beats are tiny. A half smile from Freya when Colt does something unexpectedly competent, like he momentarily forgets to be small and lets a bit of his old instincts slip. A micro expression on Colt's face when Freya's name is mentioned in a briefing or over comms. It's those milliseconds that sell the idea that these two people's histories are intertwined in ways we're only gradually allowed to see. Visually, Tempest leans into contrast. The janitor spaces are cramped, low-ceilinged, lit with this sickly, institutional lighting that makes everything feel slightly worn out. The world of the mechs, on the other hand, is big, angular, bathed in harsh whites and deep shadows. When Colt is in one world, he looks like he doesn't belong. When he steps into the other, you realize that's where the shape of him actually makes sense, for better or worse. The staging reinforces that. There are shots where he's dwarfed by machinery, yes, but there are also cockpit shots framed tight on his face, floating against the abstract glow of interface displays, where he suddenly looks mythic. The alien swarm itself is less about detailed creature design and more about presence. The way the show portrays them feels like a force of nature rather than individualized monsters. On the macro level, they are this undulating mass on sensors, an overwhelming number ticking ever upward. On the micro level, when the Tempest actually engages them, you hear the staccato rhythm of impacts, the high-pitched shrieks of their attacks, the grinding sound of metal on exoskeleton. Sound design does a lot of heavy lifting here, These aren't polite, cinematic booms, they're messy, layered noises that make you feel like the cockpit is one cracked panel away from being broken open. There's a particular battle sequence against the alien swarm where the music really stood out to me. Instead of going full bombastic orchestral from the first volley, it starts with this restrained, almost minimalist motif, a repeating pattern that mirrors Colt's controlled breathing as he fully locks into that 100% neural sync. As the fight intensifies, layers are added, low strings, choral elements, percussive hits that line up with each major strike from the Tempest. Then, just when you expect it to explode into a huge, hero saves the world anthem, the track actually undercuts itself for a moment, dropping into this nearly bare, haunting variation. It's like the score is reminding you, yes, this is epic, but it's also horrifying. That's one of the things I appreciated about Tempest's approach to music and sound. It's not just hyping you up, it's also judging the violence a little. In scenes where Colt is forced to push beyond what any single pilot should handle, the audio mix gets almost oppressive. You hear the strain in his breathing, the crackle of overloaded systems, the slightly too loud clank of the mecha's joints. That attention to texture makes the big hero moments feel hard-earned rather than just splashy. Now, I do think there are times when the show leans a little too hard on dramatic silence. There are multiple dialogue scenes where characters just stare at each other for what feels like 5 extra beats, with the ambient sound dropped way down, and you're meant to read oceans of subtext into it. Sometimes that works, like when Colt and Freya are both wrestling with their unspoken history. Sometimes it feels like the editing is stalling to make a simple interaction look deeper than it is. I'm all for letting moments breathe, but there are a few points where I could practically feel the director going, pause, more meaning, more. At the core, though, the themes of Tempest are pretty clear and resonate regardless of whether every single scene lands. Trauma and responsibility are the big ones. Colt is someone whose entire life has been defined by a catastrophic loss, his parents' deaths, and by being weaponized as the Mech King. Hiding as a janitor is his way of trying to exist without being a weapon. The problem is, the universe doesn't stop needing what he can do just because he's tired. The alien swarm keeps advancing. Freya keeps putting herself on the line. The show keeps asking the same uncomfortable question: how much does one damaged person owe a dying world? That ties into another theme I found compelling, the morality of exceptionalism. Colt's 100% neural sync isn't just rare, it's framed as almost unnatural. No one else can do what he does with the Tempest. On one hand, that makes him this incredible asset, on the other, it traps him. The story keeps circling this idea that when you're uniquely capable, you don't get to fully opt out. That's a harsh, kind of depressing read, and the show doesn't sugarcoat it. There's no fantasy where Colt can both live a quiet janitor life and save everyone. It's either his soul or the world, and often both get shredded. Freya's arc intersects with that in a different way. While we don't have all her backstory laid out in flashing neon, the basics we do know: that she saved Colt, that she's later betrayed and thrown into a lethal duel, sketch out someone who's trying to work inside a system that eventually tries to kill her. Her betrayal isn't just personal, it's ideological. She believes in something enough to fight for it, and the very structure she's upholding turns on her when she becomes inconvenient. That makes her decision to keep stepping into danger feel like a choice rather than a default. For Colt, danger comes to him whether he wants it or not. For Freya, she walks toward it even after it's burned her. What I liked is that their relationship isn't reduced to, she inspires him to be a hero, in some simplistic way. Yes, Freya is the catalyst, they make that explicit with her being forced into the duel, but the show doesn't turn her into a mere symbol. She's not just someone for Colt to protect. She has her own agency, her own rage, her own compromises. There are moments where you can feel Freya would rather die on her own terms than be used as a pawn again, and that stubbornness is both her strength and her vulnerability. Here's a little aside. Though, watching Colt silently pine for Freya for so long did make me want to shake him a few times. There's only so many intense, wordless stares you can do before I start yelling at my screen like, buddy, just say one actual sentence about how you feel. But that frustration is kind of the point. The show is very much about what goes unsaid, because saying it out loud would force these characters to make choices they're not ready to make yet. Structurally, Tempest tries to weave between three core modes: intimate drama, political and military maneuvering, and big sci-fi action. How successfully it does that kind of depends on what you're looking for. The intimate drama stuff, Colt alone in storage rooms, Freya processing betrayal, quiet almost conversations between them, is where the writing feels most precise. The big action set pieces with the Tempest and the alien swarm are where the directing flexes the hardest. The political and military parts, the behind-the-scenes betrayals and machinations, are a bit more hit or miss. They are necessary, but they don't always have the same emotional specificity. One thing I kept noticing in the editing is how often they cut back from explosions and mech clashes to Colt's face in the cockpit. Even in the most chaotic battles, the show recenters on his reaction. You get close-ups of his pupils tracking targets, the sweat bead running down his temple, the slight tremor in his fingers as he grips the controls. It's a way of saying, yes, there's a war, yes, there are aliens, but this is still a story about one man's nervous system being pushed beyond breaking. That choice grounds the spectacle in flesh and blood instead of letting it turn into visual wallpaper. At the same time, there are moments where I wished the editing would give us just a bit more clarity on the geography of fights. The alien swarm is, by design, this overwhelming mass. But occasionally, the way shots are stitched together makes it hard to track exactly how the battle is evolving. You know Colt is doing something impressive because the music swells and the comms react, but visually you're getting more impressionistic flashes than clean sequences. That can be cool stylistically, there's a lot of energy and chaos, but it does trade off some strategic clarity. The way the Tempest itself moves is a character choice in its own right. Early on, when Colt first reclaims the cockpit, the mecha's movements feel heavy, almost hesitant, like he's reacquainting himself with an old body. There are these half-second delays between Colt's focus sharpening and the frame of the Tempest fully committing to an action. As he sinks deeper into that 100% neural sync state, those delays disappear. The mech starts moving with this terrifying immediacy, almost before you consciously register Colt's intent. That progression sells the idea that pilot and machine are fusing into something new, something that's not entirely under human moral control. The show is also smart about when it lets that fusion falter. Syncing at 100% isn't just a big glowing meter, it's a state that takes something out of Colt every time he reaches for it. You see the aftermath in the small details, how drained he looks coming out of the cockpit, how long he stares at his own hands, like he's not fully sure where the mech ends and he begins. Those post-battle come-downs are some of my favorite bits of quiet acting, because they capture the cost of being legendary better than any medal ceremony or victory speech could. If we pull back and look at story and pacing as a whole, Tempest feels like it's built on a slow ramp up to a huge moral cliff. The early stretch is almost entirely about establishing Colt's refusal to re-engage with the world and hinting at Freya's importance in his life. The mid-game is where the betrayal and the duel shove him off the edge and force him into that first, fully committed resync with the Tempest. The late game, where the alien swarm becomes an extinction-level threat, is the fallout. The stakes go cosmic, but the emotional questions stay pretty grounded. How many times can you ask the same person to save everyone, and what parts of him get sacrificed each time? Where it starts to wobble a little is in how often it revisits the same beats from slightly different angles. We get multiple reminders that Colt is the only one who can hit that 100% neural sync, that Freya is both his emotional anchor and his guilt point, that the alien swarm is coming and conventional defenses are useless. All of that is important, but sometimes the script seems less confident about pushing characters into new territory and more content to reiterate the stakes we already understand. A tighter trim on some of those reiterations could have made the overall pace feel more relentless without losing depth. There is, however, something almost hypnotic about how insistently the show returns to Colt's grief over his parents. We don't get a blow-by-blow flashback of their deaths, at least not in the sense of a single, definitive sequence laid out cleanly. Instead, we see fragmented impressions, the echo of voices, the memory of reaching hands, the hollow ring of their absence in moments when he most needs guidance. The neural sync pulls those half-buried shards of memory to the surface in stressful situations, and the way they intrude on his present makes his trauma feel lived in rather than just backstory. I also appreciated that the show doesn't treat Colt's grief as something he has to get over in order to be effective. If anything, the narrative suggests that his pain is bound up with his capacity to connect so fully with the Tempest. His vulnerability and his power are entangled. That's a more complicated, and frankly more honest, take than the standard, learn to let go and then you'll be your best self, arc. Letting go, for Colt, would probably mean never piloting again. Holding on is what lets him reach that terrifying 100% neural sync, but it also means reliving every loss every time he fights. Freya's emotional palette is different, and that contrast is part of what makes their scenes crackle. Where Colt implodes, she explodes. Her betrayal doesn't send her into hiding, it throws gasoline on her sense of injustice. You can see her drawing lines in the sand, who she still trusts, what she's willing to compromise on, and every fresh manipulation or half-truth makes those lines darker. She's not naive. But there's a core of idealism in her that the show keeps testing. Will she still believe in anything once she fully understands how expendable she is to the people who put her in that lethal duel? I really liked one quiet beat after the duel setup, before Colt intervenes, where Freya is alone with her mech. We don't need exact dialogue to understand what's happening there. It's the way she reaches out and rests her forehead against the cold metal, the way her fists clench and unclench. There's no audience for her in that moment, no grandstanding. It's just a woman who knows she's been used, steeling herself to step into a machine that might become her coffin anyway. That's the kind of textured, character-first storytelling Tempest does well when it gives itself the space. If there's a criticism to level at the relationship side of things, it's that the show sometimes veers so far into restraint that it risks emotional constipation. I respect a slow burn, I live for subtext, but there are long stretches where I wanted one of them, Colt especially, to crack just a little more openly. A confrontation, an argument, even a badly handled confession would have added a different kind of energy to their bond. The stoicism fits the world, but it can also make the emotional pacing feel flatter than it needs to be. Still, the restraint does avoid another trap, melodrama. With ingredients like dead parents, secret legends, betrayals, and apocalypse, this could have gone full soap opera very quickly. Instead, the tone leans more toward somber intensity. Even the larger-than-life moments are played with a certain groundedness. When Colt finally hits that sustained 100% neural sync in a major battle, it's not accompanied by cocky grins and quips. It's almost frightening. His voice gets quieter, not louder. The Tempest moves like it's chasing inevitability rather than glory. From a purely visceral standpoint, that 100% sync is also where the show's visuals get most creative. The boundaries between cockpit and battlefield blur. Backgrounds smear into streaks of light, targeting data overlays like a second layer of reality, and you occasionally get stylized glimpses of the alien swarm not as distinct forms but as red blotches on a neural map. The whole sequence feels like being inside a brain that's processing too much information at once and just barely keeping it all coherent. It's a smart way of translating immense speed and precision into something cinematic. One element that might be divisive is how spirituality adjacent the show allows the neural sync to feel. It never outright says, this is mystical, but the way characters talk about Colt's connection with the Tempest, the reverence in some of the visual language when they show him syncing, it all has a slightly religio-mythic flavor. If you're here strictly for hard sci-fi, that might bug you. Personally, I thought it fit the dramatic vibe. In a world where an extinction-level alien swarm exists, where one man and one machine can tip the scales, of course people would start treating that like something sacred or cursed. The alien threat itself is interesting more for what it brings out in human characters than for what it is on its own. We're told it's an extinction-level swarm, this overwhelming, encroaching doom. But the real drama is in how people respond to that pressure, who doubles down on control, who betrays allies, who sacrifices others to buy time, who steps up despite wanting to disappear. The aliens are almost like a natural disaster, massive, terrifying, but emotionally neutral. The moral ugliness and beauty come entirely from the human side. That's why Colt's re-emergence as the Mech King doesn't feel purely triumphant. Every time he goes out there in the Tempest, saving lives by ending others, you can sense the world quietly reorganizing itself around that fact. Leaders start planning with the assumption that he'll be available to bail them out. Enemies recalibrate their strategies. Freya has to grapple with the reality that the man she saved is now being drawn back into the exact role that almost destroyed him. There's a creeping inevitability to it, like history is pulling him back into the same pattern and daring him to break it. One of the more uncomfortable through lines, for me, was the implication that Colt is both victim and instrument. His parents' deaths broke him. Freya's compassion saved him. But at the end of the day, the world doesn't see Colt the way he sees himself. To the people in charge, he's the Mech King, full stop, a weapon of last resort. His humanity is almost an inconvenient glitch in the system. The show doesn't hammer this home with big speeches, but you feel it in how often he's talked about as an asset rather than a person, how rare it is for anyone besides Freya to ask how he's holding up. That tension between who he is and what he's used for is at the heart of why the drama works. It turns every big battle into a double-edged sword. Yes, watching the Tempest tear through the alien swarm is satisfying on a surface level, the choreography, the sound design, the sheer kinetic thrill. But layered underneath is this sick little knot in your stomach, because every display of power is another brick in the wall surrounding Colt's ability to ever walk away again. There's a moment, after a particularly brutal engagement, where Colt is sitting alone, still in his pilot suit, and the camera just holds on him breathing. No music. No dialogue. Just the small, human sound of someone trying to steady themselves after doing the impossible again. It reminded me, weirdly, of pro athletes after a game they barely survived, except instead of a trophy, his reward is another mission request. Scenes like that are where Tempest feels less like a flashy mech show and more like a very specific character study that happens to involve giant machines. And yet, for all that heaviness, the show does have flashes of dry humor. They are not constant, and they are not jokey in a Marvel quippy way, but they exist. A throwaway line from a tech complaining about how the Tempest ruins their maintenance schedules. A moment where Colt, still in his janitor mindset, automatically starts cleaning up a spill in a hangar even though he's now technically the most important pilot alive. Those little beats keep the world from collapsing under the weight of its own seriousness. In an odd way. I actually wish Tempest leaned into that grounded humor just a bit more, especially in the early stretch. We spend so much time in Colt's isolating grief and Freya's righteous anger that a couple of extra humanizing interactions, gallows humor among the rank and file, small moments of levity, could have made the darker beats hit even harder by contrast. The world feels real in terms of stakes and texture, but sometimes a bit airless in terms of everyday life continuing around the crisis. That being said, when the show zooms in on the little human details in the middle of chaos, it really clicks. A hand trembling over a launch button. Someone flinching at the distant sound of a mech weapon, even though they are technically safe behind multiple layers of shielding. Freya pausing for half a second before putting on her pilot gear, like she has to consciously step into the role again each time. These are the kinds of touches that tell you the creators aren't just here for cool robots, they actually care about the people inside them. There's also a subtle class element baked into Colt's janitor status that the show plays with nicely. He's literally cleaning up after the people who make decisions about war and peace, walking unnoticed through hallways where strategies are set that will cost lives. That invisibility is both protection and insult. By the time everyone remembers who he is, who he was, you can sense this bitter irony. The only way the system really sees him is when he's back inside the Tempest, killing on their behalf. As long as he's just pushing a mop, he's beneath notice. That irony feeds directly into the emotional stakes of Freya's betrayal. She was the one person who saw value in Colt when he wasn't in a cockpit, when he was just a broken man barely hanging on. For her to then be treated as disposable by the same structures she's helped maintain underlines exactly why Colt was hiding in the first place. It's not that he doesn't care about the world, it's that he doesn't trust the people running it not to turn him and the people he loves into ammunition. Where things get especially tense is in the way the show frames Colt's decision to finally stop running. It's not a clean, heroic, I choose to be the Mech King again, moment. It's a messy, reluctant, I can't watch her die, reflex that snowballs into something much bigger than he intended. That nuance matters. It keeps the emotional logic anchored in his relationship to Freya rather than in abstract duty. The aliens are the enormous backdrop, Freya is the reason he moves. And from there, everything spirals outward. And from there, everything spirals outward. Colt's choice to step into the Tempest for Freya doesn't stay their thing for long. The moment he hits that 100% neural sync and the alien swarm gets its first real taste of what the Mech King can do, the whole balance of power shifts. Suddenly, everyone who thought they'd buried this legend is scrambling to either control him, depend on him, or destroy him. And the show, for better and worse, tries to trace all the fallout from that single, desperate decision. What really lands about this escalation is that Colt never gets a clean victory high. Even after wiping out a terrifying number of aliens and saving Freya from that lethal duel setup, he doesn't walk out of the cockpit pumping his fists. He looks wrecked. The series is very intentional about that. His triumphs are shot almost like horror aftermaths, dimly lit hangars, tired technicians, Colt peeling off his pilot gear like it's glued to his skin. Freya looking at him like she's relieved he's alive but also aware that something inside him just cracked wide open again. You can almost feel him thinking, I promised myself I'd never do this again. And now I'm right back here. From a pacing standpoint, once Colt's identity is blown open, the show basically shifts into a different gear. The slow, almost claustrophobic janitor chapters open up into larger-scale operations, alien swarm responses, and the political scrambling around how to deploy the Tempest. There's this buzzing urgency in every scene, everyone has an opinion on what Colt should do next, and almost none of those opinions line up with what he actually wants. If you've ever watched a friend suddenly become the talented one in a system that only sees talent, not burnout, you know that vibe. Colt goes from walking hallways no one notices to being the gravity center of every room he steps into. Here's where I think the series gets clever but also a little messy. It doesn't pretend his legend is just inspiring. The awe is there, sure. You see it in the way some pilots and staff stare at him, half hero worship, half raw fear. But you also see resentment. People who've been risking their lives this whole time suddenly get reduced to background noise because the Mech King is back. The script lets those cracks show, mostly in sharp little side glances and half-finished sentences. It's not a major subplot, but it colors the atmosphere in a way I really appreciated. The world doesn't just neatly rearrange itself around Colt, it groans while it does it. I kept asking myself this question while I watched the later arcs: is Colt actually becoming freer as he reclaims the Tempest, or is he just trading one kind of prison for another? The janitor life was a cage built from his own fear and grief. The Mech King life is a cage built from necessity and dependency. Either way, he's not exactly strolling into open fields. And the show seems pretty aware of that paradox. Every time someone calls him our last hope, or the only one who can, it hits less like a compliment and more like a threat. One of the best things Tempest does in this stretch is refuse to let the 100% neural sync become simple wish fulfillment. There's this temptation in a lot of mecha and sci-fi to treat the perfect sync, or limit break, state as this clean, glorious thing. The music swells, the enemies explode, the hero grins in slow motion. Tempest plays it more like an addiction. When Colt's in that zone, he's terrifyingly effective, yeah, but he's also teetering on the edge of losing himself completely in the machine. And the show finds visual ways to sell that. The cockpit view blurs at the edges, colors oversaturate, sound warps like it's underwater, his own breathing starts echoing back at him like someone else's. There's a deep anxiety running through those scenes. If he stays in that sync for too long, what exactly comes back out of the cockpit? A man? A weapon? Something in between? The aliens might be the obvious threat, but the person I was most worried about by the second half of the series was Colt himself. Freya's perspective in all this shifts in a really satisfying way too. Early on, she's this mix of toughness and belief, still clinging to the idea that there's a right side to fight on, even inside compromised systems. Once Colt steps up publicly, though, her role becomes more complicated. On one hand, she owes him her life. On the other, she can see more clearly than anyone how this machine, the metaphorical one, not just the Tempest, is about to chew him up again. There are moments where she almost becomes his conscience, and others where she has to be the one pushing him back into the fire because the alternative is planetary extinction. There's one scene, easily one of my favorites, where Colt comes out of a devastating battle with the swarm and is clearly dissociating. His hands are still twitching like they're gripping controls. His eyes are locked on some point that isn't there, like he's still mentally mid-fight. Freya approaches, and for a second he doesn't seem to recognize her. She says his name once. No response. She steps closer, says it again, a little sharper. Still nothing. Then, instead of going for some big tearful slap or overblown hug, she just grabs his hand and presses it flat against the cold wall of the hangar. "You're here," she says. Simple. Practical. Grounding. That tiny gesture absolutely wrecked me. No soaring music, no dramatic lighting, just the mechanical hum of the hangar and two people trying to remind one of them where his body actually is. It's a perfect example of the show understanding that the real war isn't just the Tempest versus the alien swarm, it's Colt versus the gradual erosion of his selfhood. From here, the aliens start to matter less as individual encounters and more as this constant tidal pressure. The series doesn't go into meticulous detail about their biology or culture or anything, they are more like a living catastrophe bearing down. What that does, storytelling-wise, is make every non-battle scene feel like it's happening under the same ticking clock. Even in quiet conversations, you have this sense that there's a wall of death slowly moving inward just off-screen. It keeps the tension simmering without having to throw CGI at you every 5 seconds. But here's where I want to poke the show a little. I think it occasionally leans too heavily on that ever-present threat as an excuse not to fully flesh out some of the human side machinations. We get references to strategies, to changing battlefronts, to different approaches on how to use Colt and the Tempest, but they are often sketched in broad strokes. If you're the kind of viewer who wants intricate tactical breakdowns, that might feel thin. The focus is firmly on emotional consequence, not on the nitty-gritty of war logistics. In a weird twist, I actually liked that choice more than I expected. It keeps the alien swarm from becoming, like, a video game map you could diagram. Instead, the real maps you're tracking are inside people, Colt's guilt patterns, Freya's trust fractures, the fault lines inside whatever command structure they are under. It becomes less, how do we flank the aliens, and more, how long before this pressure makes someone we care about do something unforgivable. One thing Tempest does well in the late game is let Freya's betrayal ripple forward. It's not just this one traumatic event we move past, it changes the way she reads every offer, every opportunity, every supposed ally. There's a scene where someone, one of the generic higher-ups, will keep them nameless, tries to praise her for her sacrifice in that rigged duel, like it was all part of some noble plan. The camera cuts to Freya's eyes, and you can see the icy politeness over a furnace of pure contempt. She's clocking every word, every manipulation. She knows exactly how close she came to dying for someone else's convenience. You start to see this subtle divergence between Colt and Freya's coping mechanisms. Colt internalizes everything, every death, every risk, every second of that sink. He turns it inward. Freya, by contrast, lets more of that anger move outward. She pushes back against authority, challenges orders, calls out hypocrisy. The cool part is the show resists simplifying either response into right or wrong. Colt's inward spiral gives him the focus to do what no one else can. Freya's outward push stops the people in charge from turning everyone into fodder. Both unnecessary. Both are unsustainable alone. I want to call out the acting again here, because this second half stretch is where the performers really start playing in the micro range. Colt's actor, especially, sells the gradual hollowing out without turning him into a zombie. His posture gets straighter in some scenes, more like the mech king he used to be, but his eyes betray him. There's this haunted flicker whenever someone says, "We need you out there again," like he's already mourning the parts of himself he's about to leave on the battlefield. It's subtle, and it hurts. Freya, meanwhile, gets sharper edges but also more exposed nerves. When she challenges orders, it's not just bravado, you can see the cost of going up against people who control her life. There's one beat where she starts to argue, cuts herself off, physically looks like she swallows the rest of the sentence, then chooses a more politically survivable wording. That's the kind of detail that makes her feel like a person navigating power, not a pure rebel archetype. In terms of visuals and editing, the late-game battles kick up another notch in terms of scale. The alien swarm grows more overwhelming, waves upon waves, like shooting into a storm cloud and only carving tiny gaps. The Tempest gets put in more desperate positions, flanked, outnumbered, pushed into maneuvers that look physically wrong for a machine that size. The animation or VFX, depending how you imagine it, sell the weight impressively. You never forget that this is a giant, multi-ton machine, even when it's moving with inhuman responsiveness. Where the show makes a stylistically bold choice is how often it cuts away from the clean, wide, cool shots of the Tempest in action and dives back into fragmented, almost abstract imagery during high-stress sync moments. You get flashes of Colt's memories, the outline of his parents' faces, Freya's silhouette, even the janitor corridor where he used to drag that mop. It's like his entire life has been wired into the Tempest's interface and is now being remixed every time he fights. It's beautiful and deeply uncomfortable. There's a kind of running metaphor here that I found more compelling the longer I sat with it. The Tempest isn't just a mech, it's Colt's trauma processor. Every unresolved feeling, every guilt, every love he never said out loud gets fed into this machine as fuel. That's what makes the 100% neural sync so potent and so horrifying. It's not just a technological connection, it's an emotional one. He's literally weaponizing his own heart against the aliens, and that's a cost no one around him seems fully prepared to pay on his behalf. Here's where I'm going to drop my biggest contrarian take about this show. I actually like that Colt never turns into a traditional inspirational leader. Yes, he becomes the center of the war effort because of his abilities. Yes, people rally around the idea of the Mech King. But as a person, he never shifts into that crowd-rousing, speech-giving archetype. He's awkward. He's not great with emotions in public. He's more likely to dodge a compliment than accept it. And I love that. It makes the whole thing feel less like a Destiny story and more like a messy case of, the wrong guy happens to be the only one who can do this, so now we all live with that. That choice has ripple effects in the way the narrative handles heroism. Instead of big speechifying, we get small choices, Colt agreeing to one more sortie than he should, Freya stepping between him and a command he clearly can't handle, nameless personnel pushing themselves a little harder because they just watched this broken man crawl out of the Tempest again. The drama stays grounded in those tiny, exhausted acts of courage. Musically, the back half of Tempest really doubles down on motifs associated with Colt and Freya. Colt's theme, which started as this restrained, almost mournful pattern during his janitor days, gets reorchestrated into something more intense during his syncs, but the core melody doesn't change. It's still sad. Even in victory, there's this undercurrent of loss. Freya's theme, on the other hand, tends to come in during scenes where she's asserting herself or pushing back. It's more rhythmic, a little jagged around the edges, like it's constantly trying to break out of its own time signature. The clever part is when those motifs start overlapping. In key scenes between the two of them, you can hear hints of both themes braided together, his melancholy, her defiance. Sometimes they resolve into something harmonious, sometimes they clash. It's like the soundtrack is quietly commenting on where their relationship is at, without needing dialogue to spell it out. If you're someone who pays attention to scores, there's a lot to appreciate there. There are also a few really gutsy uses of silence near the end. One in particular sticks with me, a moment where Colt makes a decision that essentially commits him to a course with no return. Everything leading up to it has been loud, sirens, overlapping voices, the constant distant rumble of the swarm. Then he says what he's going to do, and the sound just dies. No music. No ambience. Just his breathing and the soft mechanical clicks as he prepares. It's like the world holds its breath with him. Silence is a cliché in drama, but when it's earned like that, it absolutely slaps. Okay, let's talk about the ending trajectory without giving away every last detail. We know from the premise that Colt, in The Tempest, saves the world from an extinction-level alien swarm. That's not really a twist, it's the promise. The question the show cares about isn't will he succeed, but what does succeeding cost him? And on that front, I think Tempest mostly delivers. The final stretch builds to this sense that Colt and the Tempest are reaching a point of no physical or psychological return. Each neural sync seems to come faster, hit harder, dig deeper into him. Freya's warnings grow more urgent. The people in charge get more desperate. The alien swarm changes, adapts, presses harder. Everything's converging on this ugly reality. To end this, Colt may have to push past every boundary that was meant to keep him remotely human. Visually, the way the last big operation is staged feels like the logical climax of everything that came before. The Tempest is thrown into an environment that's utterly hostile, not just in terms of enemies, but in terms of physics itself. Gravity anomalies, electromagnetic storms, sensor interference, we don't need the technical jargon to get it. You can see the mech straining like it's moving through wet cement and fire at the same time. It's less cool mecha fight, and more, watch a human will claw reality into shape for one last time. Emotionally, what makes it work is how tightly the show keeps cutting back to Colt and Freya in those final moments. Even when they are physically separated, him in the storm of battle, her stuck somewhere far less cinematic, you never lose sight of the thread between them. Freya's voice on the comm, Colt's tiny reactions to hearing her, the pauses that say more than any speech, the climax is built on that connection as much as on particle beams and alien shrieks. I will say, if you're hoping for a big, explicit romantic payoff, Tempest might frustrate you a little. The show is stubbornly committed to understatement. Feelings are there, obvious, if you've been watching, but they rarely get turned into declarations. Personally, I respected that choice. The stakes are so high, the time is so short, that stopping everything for a long, flowery confession would have felt wrong. What we get instead are decisions that scream, "I love you," louder than words would. For me, that's more powerful, even if it's also more emotionally painful. Here's a small personal confession. There was a point near the end where I caught myself kind of angry at Freya. Not because she did anything wrong, exactly, but because she kept pushing Colt to fight when I just wanted someone, anyone, to tell him, "You don't have to do this." And then I had to sit with the uncomfortable realization that I was holding her to a different standard than everyone else. No one else had an out either. The aliens weren't politely offering negotiated peace terms. Freya had been manipulated and nearly killed, she was still standing. Of course she wasn't going to be the one to yank him out at the last moment and let the world burn. That's part of why this show sticks with me. It doesn't offer a safe, morally clean path. Every choice sucks. Every good outcome is welded to a bad cost. It doesn't mean the ending is nihilistic, the fact that Colt does save the world matters. But there's no version of that salvation where everyone walks away whole and happy. And I respect the show for leaning into that instead of pretending otherwise. From a structural critic's lens, the last few episodes do walk a thin line between relentless and slightly exhausting. The constant escalation, the ever-intensifying sinks, the repeated framing of "this might be the last time" can start to blend if you binge it. I think it plays better if you give yourself breathing room, watch an episode, go make a snack, touch grass, then come back. The emotional register is so high for so long that without breaks, some subtleties risk getting lost in the noise. That said, there are also some beautifully quiet pockets in that final run. A short conversation in a hallway where Colt and Freya almost talk about what happens after all this, and then don't. A moment of shared silence in a locker room. Colt staring at a janitor's cart shoved into a corner, realizing he'll probably never go back to that anonymity again. Freya looking at the Tempest like it's both miracle and monster. Those little breaths are where the series reminds you that, under all the sci-fi trappings, this is primarily about two people trying, and often failing, to hold on to themselves in a dehumanizing crisis. One thing I want to praise that might get overlooked, the show's command of physical space. Hangars, corridors, cockpits, even open battlefields, they are all framed in ways that tell you how characters relate to them. Early on, Colt looks small in every environment. Later, he starts to fit the cockpit shots more naturally while looking slightly out of place everywhere else. Freya, meanwhile, often stands centered in doorways, at the thresholds of rooms, like she's always half in and half out of whatever structure she's dealing with, never fully owned by it, never fully free of it. It's subtle blocking, but it adds a ton. Sound design in the cockpit during the final phase is another quiet triumph. We hear the creak of the Tempest's frame under strain, the warning beeps stacking on top of each other, the faint distortion on Freya's voice when the signal's unstable. There are even moments where Colt's own heartbeat seems to blend into the mecha's internal hum, making it unclear where one ends and the other begins. It's a very effective way of selling the idea that 100% neural sync isn't just about control, it's about identity blur. If I step back and look at Tempest as a whole, not just in terms of individual scenes, I'd describe it as a character study disguised as a mech apocalypse. The plot beats, legendary pilot in hiding, betrayal, forced duel, legendary comeback, apocalyptic swarm, are almost archetypal. We've seen variations of them in anime, sci-fi dramas, even some games. What makes this stand out is how deeply it commits to showing the emotional residue of each beat rather than just the spectacle. It's not perfect. There are pacing lulls, especially when the series hovers too long in, we know the aliens are coming, we know Colt is unique, we know Freya is torn, without adding a new wrinkle. Some of the political scheming is a bit underbaked compared to the richness of Colt and Freya's inner lives. There are secondary characters who feel more like functional mouthpieces for themes or plot exposition than fully realized people. If you're looking for a big ensemble drama where everyone gets an equally complex arc, this isn't that. But what it does choose to focus on, it handles with surprising maturity. Colt's trauma isn't cured by heroism. Freya's betrayal doesn't turn her into a martyr or a saint, it makes her pricklier, more suspicious, sometimes even harsher than you want her to be. The alien swarm isn't defeated through clever loopholes so much as through raw, terrifying sacrifice. The 100% neural sync isn't magic, it's a wound Colt chooses to reopen every time he fights. Those are bold, emotionally honest choices. There's also something quietly radical about how the show portrays love in the middle of all this. It's not saccharine. It's not transactional. Colt doesn't come back just because Freya is the girl. He comes back because she represents the only person who ever looked at him and saw something more than a weapon or a failure. And Freya doesn't cling to him as some savior, she wrestles with him, challenges him, calls him out, and still refuses to let the world grind him down without a fight. It's messy, adult affection, expressed more in hard decisions than in pretty words. If I had to pinpoint the single most haunting image from the whole drama, it's not actually one of the big battles. It's Colt, back in that hangar, standing in front of the Tempest after the world has theoretically been saved. The mech is silent. Systems offline. The alien swarm threat has been stopped. He reaches out to touch the metal again, like he did the first time he reclaimed it, but this time his hand hovers, trembles, and doesn't quite make contact. It's like he's afraid that if he touches it, it'll all start up again. That's such a rich, ambiguous note, gratitude, fear, addiction, grief, all layered in one almost touch. I'll be honest, finishing Tempest left me with this weird, hollowed-out feeling, in a good way. You know that post-game or post-show crash where you close the thing and just kind of sit there, replaying certain scenes in your mind? I had that. Not because of the alien fights, though those are cool, but because Colt's journey feels so unfairly human. He didn't ask to be exceptional. He certainly didn't ask to be the last line between his world and annihilation. He wanted to push a cart, mop floors, keep his head down. And the universe said, nope. You don't get that life. So where do I land on Tempest, the last mecha as a whole? I put it solidly in the really strong, emotionally resonant, occasionally uneven category. The show aims higher than your average, cool mechs and big explosions series. Sometimes it hits that higher target dead center, sometimes it wobbles a bit on the way there, but it almost never feels lazy. You can feel the thought behind the choices, especially around Colt and Freya, even when you disagree with how drawn out or restrained some of those choices are. If you're mainly here for non-stop action, you might find the first stretch slow and the middle a bit repetitive in its emotional beats. But if you're the kind of viewer who likes watching a character's body language shift across a season, or listening for how a musical motif changes as someone hardens or softens, Tempest gives you a lot to chew on. It's a mech drama that actually cares about what the cockpit does to your head, not just what the mech does to the enemy. Would I recommend it? Yeah, with some qualifiers. If you love mecha, character-driven sci-fi, or stories where trauma and duty collide in messy ways, this is absolutely worth your time. The janitor setup isn't just a gimmick, it's the spine of the whole thing. Colt's reluctance, his grief, his weirdly gentle nature under all the steel, that's what gives the 100% neural sync its sting. And if you're into complex, quietly fierce women who aren't there to be rescued, Freya is going to stick with you. If you're allergic to slow burn emotional arcs, if you want your mech fights crystal clear tactically and constant, or if you need clean moral lines where heroes are heroes and systems are either fully good or fully evil, you might bounce off parts of this. Tempest lives in grey zones. It likes uncomfortable questions. It's more likely to give you a knot in your chest than a neat catharsis. For me, though, I'm glad I spent time with it. It got under my skin. I'm still thinking about Colt staring at his own hands, about Freya pressing his palm to that hangar wall, about the way the Tempest feels less like a machine and more like a mirror he keeps being forced to look into. That's not nothing. If you made it all the way through this breakdown, you're exactly my kind of viewer. Let me know in the comments what hit you hardest. Was it Colt's first return to the cockpit, Freya's duel, the alien swarm battles, or some tiny character beat I didn't even mention? And if you want more deep dives into dramas and games that mix big spectacle with bigger feelings, you know where to find me. This is Bongo Gaming, signing off. Go drink some water, maybe touch something that isn't a screen, and I'll see you in the next one.